Once Again is funded in part by Union Bank and Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media. Family owned for 60 years, UBT and its people are invested in the success of families, businesses, and communities. Member FDIC.
So, this is a story about a Nebraska schoolteacher who was arrested. When I say that, what comes to mind? No, he wasn't arrested for what just popped into your head. This was in 1920, so maybe that's a clue. And no, not for teaching evolution and Darwinism. But Robert Meyer was convicted by a jury in Hamilton County for what he was teaching his students. A judge and jury convicted him for teaching German. That violated Nebraska law at the time. Rather than paying the $25 fine, Mr. Meyer took his case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The opinion from that case, Meyer v. Nebraska, became one of the most important cases in legal history, not just in this state, in the United States. We're talking about it once again, because to this day, this Nebraska schoolteacher's decision to stand up for his convictions echoes in the current discussions about which liberties an American should be guaranteed. Whether you know it or not, it's influenced your life. This is Once Again, a podcast from Nebraska Public Media about the stuff of history that's shaping the news today. I'm Bill Kelly, your host and researcher. It's amazing how often a huge legal issue starts with regular people just trying to live their lives. It's something I've seen again and again as a reporter for 40-plus years. In this case, it's Robert Meyer. Of course, I never met him. He started teaching in Nebraska in the early 1900s. What may be the only photo of him shows a slight man in his 40s with round glasses and a neatly trimmed mustache. We know he's a family man, a family with 6 kids. His one-room schoolhouse sat next to the Lutheran Church in Hampton, Nebraska. The little church on the prairie loomed over the spring crops in Hamilton County, still does. You can spot the steeple of Zion Lutheran Church from miles away. Sometimes Mr. Meyer would help summon the congregation by ringing the church bells.
And he was so small, the rope would literally pull him up off the floor because he just wasn't that large of a man.
That's David Fetter. He's the current pastor of Zion Lutheran. We sat in the church sanctuary and talked about Mr. Meyer.
He would have been fully engaged in the life of this congregation when it came to the school and worship and any kind of social things that happened here too.
German Lutheran immigrants, mostly farmers, organized the congregation in 1873.
They were meeting in their homes, using hymnals and Bibles they brought with them from Germany.
They learned just enough English to get by when they took trips into town for supplies.
Otherwise, their whole lives revolved around this church campus. There wasn't a tremendous need for them to learn English immediately.
Then and now, many of the hymns sung by this congregation were written in the 1600s. The Lutheran Church's very foundation rests on its German heritage. Educating these children of immigrants became a priority for the church families. They built a one-room schoolhouse right next to the chapel.
They would have received, to a large degree, the same education a student would have received in a public school environment. The difference was they had religion classes.
Each school day, about 30 students would listen as Mr. Meyer taught in English most of the time. After 15 years of teaching, he apparently commanded the respect of children and their parents.
From what I've read about him, when he spoke authoritatively, but he didn't shout. He didn't have a big, large, booming voice. But he obviously possessed authority as a teacher.
The families that made up Zion Lutheran shared a similar life with thousands of immigrants in dozens of German-speaking congregations springing up across the Great Plains. They left Europe, just in time. In 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm, the last German emperor, dragged the nation and the world into war. England, France, and Russia joined forces to contain Germany. The United States stayed neutral until 1917. To support the war effort, civilian defense councils formed across the country, encouraging food production for the troops, conserving needed rubber and metal. However, some of these citizens went overboard in their efforts to promote patriotism. I went down to the reference room at History Nebraska and had them pull the files they have archived from the state's defense councils. Looking over the minutes of their meetings and the correspondence sent from all over the state, I was shocked at the level of hostility directed at Nebraskans of German descent. Dozens of letters revealed the anger some people felt about their small-town neighbors speaking German in public. Some asked the state to ban using the German language in church services. An anonymous letter signed by an American citizen warned that people in Petersburg, Nebraska may do some violence if the Defense Council didn't step in and stop a German-born priest from using his native language during Mass. I found newspaper reports of crowds in North Platte and Grand Island burning books printed in German. It was ugly. Maybe it shouldn't be a surprise that the Super Patriots, as they were called back then, took an especially critical tone towards the Lutheran Church, with its roots in Germany stretching back centuries. There was one document I found in the archives that really stood out. In 1917, the state-level Council of Defense sent out a letter reprinted in newspapers all over Nebraska. This appeal to patriotism warned of the dangerous tendencies of the Lutheran Church, claiming they were partial to, quote, the cause of America's enemy. These Nebraska state officials came very, very close to accusing Lutherans of being traitors. Now, the war ends in 1918. The troops come home, but suspicions about Germans linger. That led Nebraska State Senator Harry Simon from Wayne County to introduce a bill that banned teaching any foreign language in any school, public, private, or parochial, before the 8th grade. Almost all of the debate specifically singled out teaching in German. The bill flew through both chambers of the legislature with almost no opposition before it was signed by then-Governor McKelvey. By passing that law in 1919, Robert Meyer's one-room schoolhouse next to the Zion Lutheran Church became a crime scene. The pastor and parents felt it was a necessity to keep teaching their children in the language of their forefathers.
You had to know the German language in order to be confirmed and become an adult communicant member. Pure and simple.
They're taking a risk doing that.
They are. Certainly they're taking a risk. The target's on their back. There's no doubt about that.
In the spring of 1920, the Hamilton County prosecutor, Frank Edgerton, got a tip that the kids over at that church in Hampton were getting schooled in an un-American foreign language. Edgerton didn't send the sheriff to investigate. For whatever reason, as county attorney, he wanted to check this out himself.
It was May 25th. I can imagine it would have been a nice, warm spring day here in Nebraska. And he stood outside with an open window and waited until he heard German being spoken. Once he heard the German language being spoken, he came inside and he actually stood in the doorway. He didn't enter the classroom at first.
Here's what the prosecutor saw. The teacher listened and offered suggestions as 10-year-old Raymond Parpart read the Bible story of Jacob's ladder in front of the class. The local paper, the Aurora Sun, wrote about it.
Meyer informed the county attorney that if he desired to file a complaint, he best go ahead and the law would be tested out.
The standoff was described in a book written by Meyer's attorney years later. It included this quote from the teacher.
I had my choice. I knew that if I changed into the English language, he would say nothing. If I went on in German, he would come in and arrest me. I told myself that I must not flinch. and I did not flinch. I went on in German.
He was obviously breaking a law, but he was breaking a law imposed by man. A law that would have violated to some degree what God's word, what his call to serve this congregation was. That would have been the dilemma for him. Remember, it's a divine call.
And Robert Meyer saw his calling to teach in the German language.
Exactly.
This was not just a case for German Lutherans. They were just the ones with that target on their backs. Swedes, Greeks, Russian Jews, and Italian Catholics, all the immigrants, thought these language laws threatened their hope for a peaceful life in America. Some English-speaking residents dismissed those fears. An editorial in the Aurora Sun feared this teacher's convictions would challenge the American way of life.
If there are those here who, instead of obeying our laws, willingly seek to evade them, they should get out and return to the countries from which they came.
Those predictions of immigrant-led chaos never happened, but there was about to be an unimaginable shift in the law, ignited by this quiet but determined teacher from a one-room schoolhouse in Nebraska.
Once Again is funded in part by the John C. and Catherine S. Angle Charitable Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media.
The wind rattled across the Hamilton County Courthouse Square the day I visited. You could easily mistake the red brick and sandstone building for a fortress instead of a government building. It must have looked imposing to the schoolteacher Robert Meyer in 1920 when he walked through the heavy oak courtroom doors. It was the day he faced a judge charged with the crime of teaching German. And so what am I looking at?
So this is the actual file. You had to open these little metal clasps.
Up in the law library, Wendy Detlef, the clerk of the district court in this county, protects over 100 years of documents and ledgers.
And then these papers are very fragile, so that's why.
Thousands of cases heard by county or district judges, including the most famous one to pass through Hamilton County.
That opens the case, and that's telling us who the parties are. State of Nebraska versus Robert T. Meyer, and he is the defendant.
And the charge is?
Teaching foreign language in a parochial school.
Meyer went on trial twice in this building. First in county court, and there's not much of a record of those proceedings. We know it didn't take long for the Hamilton County Court to find Meyer guilty. The editorial in the Aurora Sun read, "Good for Judge Jeffers."
Men and women who love the American flag cannot help but feel proud of Judge Fred Jeffers and the brand of real, true Americanism that he displayed in upholding the provisions of the Simon language law.
One thing to remember, voters picked the judges in Nebraska back then, and 1920 was an election year. Regardless, Meyer refused to accept Judge Jeffers' verdict, and the case landed a couple of months later in district court.
And that's the subpoena for the student, for Raymond Parpart.
Directing Raymond Parpart, and then other witnesses to appear 10 a.m. on December 13th, 1920, as witnesses on behalf of the state.
Those witnesses and Robert Meyer reported across the hall to the courtroom of Judge Edward Good. Today, the courtroom is under the jurisdiction of District Court Judge Rachel Doherty. The original hand-carved blonde oak furnishings remain in use.
So this would have been the table. The state would sit at the judge's right.
This was the prosecutor's table, where County Attorney Frank Edgerton presented his case.
Probably he had political ambition. When I read the Bill of Exceptions, what struck me was that he himself went out and investigated, and that would not happen today. You would have law enforcement go investigate.
Do you have any sense that his political ambitions shaped his interest in this case?
It would not have surprised me. I mean, it was such a political hot button. The fear of the Kaiser and the fear of the Germans. you see that in politics, that sometimes politicians do stoke people's fears.
Do you have a sense of what it would have been like at the Meier trial? What the mood would have been, what it would have looked like?
You do. If you read the Bill of Exceptions or the transcript from the trial, you do. For one thing, it seemed tense.
The prosecution called the first witness.
State your name.
C.F. Brommer.
What is your occupation or profession?
I am pastor of Zion's Evangelical Lutheran Congregation.
There were no recordings of the trial. We're quoting from court records. Pastor Brommer told the jury the church felt German instruction remained important for recent immigrant families.
And they cannot give their children religious instruction in the English for that reason.
Next came the almost poignant testimony from the boy reading the Bible lesson for his classmates.
State your name.
Raymond Parpart.
How old are you?
I am 10 years of age.
Young Raymond would have come up here to be sworn in.
10-year-old boy on the witness stand.
That would be difficult. It's rare to have children of that age come in.
What school are you attending?
The Lutheran Zion's parochial school.
And he was being asked to testify against his school teacher.
Right. Oh, right. At 10, I would have been scared to death.
Now, Raymond, do you remember whether or not Mr. Meier taught you reading in German in that school last year?
Yes, sir.
The very next witness, perhaps the star witness, was kind of a shocker.
Then Frank Edgerton calls himself as a witness.
These days, Prosecutor Edgerton's choice would likely have gotten the case thrown out of court.
We cannot do that. If you're a witness, you cannot both prosecute a case and be the star witness. So when I read that, it was a little bit shocking.
Questioned by an assistant attorney, Edgerton described how he went to the one-room schoolhouse and caught Robert Meier in the act.
That is quite a statement to have the prosecuting attorney himself going out to catch him in the act.
You can't go out and investigate and prosecute your own crimes and call yourself as a witness to prove it. You would not be allowed to do that.
He's not messing around.
No,
this
he's
is a
not.
real confrontation.
Yeah, it absolutely was.
And with that, Edgerton returned to the prosecutor's table and rested his case. The defense called only one witness, Robert Meier.
Mr. Meier, are you the defendant in this case?
Yes, sir.
And you are the teacher in Zion's parochial school?
Yes, sir.
Meier told the jury how he would teach all morning in English and then break in the middle of the day for optional lessons taught in German.
I told them the first day that if anybody did not care to take the German language, they were excused from this period.
That testimony didn't sway the jury. Their verdict was guilty.
Many of those were German names. But they followed the law. It was the law at the time, and they upheld that law. I would think it would have been scary. Just the amount of pressure, I cannot imagine.
The teacher never explained to the jury why he made the choice to teach in German. He talked about it years later in an interview.
It was my duty. I am not a pastor in my church. I am a teacher. But I have the same duty to uphold my religion.
Looking back on it, the law passed in Nebraska seems unfair. Meier's attorney at the time never argued its fairness during the trial.
So is the statute unconstitutional? By that point, that it was not for Judge Good to determine. Even if the law is not what you think it ought to be, you have an obligation to follow it, and they did.
Robert Meier appealed his conviction to the Nebraska Supreme Court, but the majority of those judges felt banning foreign language instruction was good for America. But two of the judges dissented strongly. Judge Charles Letton wrote Nebraska should not let patriotism drown out decisions made by parents and teachers.
It is obvious that this restriction was the result of crowd psychology, that it is the product of the passions engendered by the World War, which had not had time to cool. Legislatures have not always respected personal rights.
That dissent, the minority opinion, foreshadows what the United States Supreme Court would say in the majority opinion just a couple of years later. And that opinion, over the next 100 years, would ricochet across the American legal system in ways that Lutheran schoolteacher would never have imagined.
Once Again is funded in part by Union Bank and Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media. Family owned for 60 years, UBT and its people are invested in the success of families, businesses, and communities. Member FDIC.
Before we get to Meyer v. Nebraska being heard by the U.S. Supreme Court, let's understand that this case is like an inkblot test for different legal philosophies.
It's mind-blowing to think that the state of Nebraska was literally the start of that history, right?
Rose Godinez serves as legal director for the American Civil Liberties Union in Nebraska. As a Spanish speaker, this case, which she studied in law school, seems personal.
It's probably and unfortunately very similar to what many immigrants currently experience and what many people of color still experience.
This is an important case.
And a case Richard Duncan, professor of constitutional law, regularly teaches in his University of Nebraska classroom. He's written journal articles about how parochial schools benefited from the Meyer case.
Anytime the government attempts to regulate what can be taught in a private religious school, you've got issues with religious liberty.
Duncan and Godinez have very, very different views on the intent and the evolution of Meyer.
This right is revered by both sides, but in ways that are inconsistent. The way that conservatives like it is not the way that progressives like it.
Let's go back to 1922. Robert Meyer would not let the state of Nebraska get the final word on this issue. To argue his case before the United States Supreme Court, he consulted Arthur Mullen, a big-shot Omaha attorney active in national-level politics. Mullen had to figure out how to convince 9 justices that the Nebraska language law conflicted with American values. He did see this as a freedom of speech thing, the First Amendment. Instead, Mullen decided to argue Nebraska violated the Constitution's 14th Amendment. It protects what's called due process, meaning the government can't take away a person's basic rights: life, liberty, property. As Godinez explains, Nebraska politicians denied Meyer his right to teach a foreign language without proper cause.
That alone is not a threat to public safety, nor does it determine a person's patriotism or allegiance to the country.
In his memoir, Attorney Mullen recalled being unsure how to read the philosophical leanings of this court, led by Chief Justice William Howard Taft. That's the only Supreme Court judge to previously serve as president. This set of justices had agreed Chinese American students could be segregated in public schools. They ruled against laws allowing a minimum wage for women. The Taft Court, on the other hand, agreed school districts could ban students who had not been vaccinated against smallpox. It was not at all clear whether this set of justices would agree with Nebraska's language law. When the U.S. Supreme Court released its ruling on June 4, 1923, the big type headline in the Omaha World Herald read, "State language law invalid, knocks out laws in 21 states." The court's majority determined the U.S. Constitution protected Robert Meyer's right to teach. But the opinion written by Justice James McReynolds went much farther than the right to teach. He also listed a set of other American liberties to be clearly defined by law. I asked Richard Duncan to read through that list.
To engage in any of the common occupations of life, to acquire useful knowledge, to marry, establish a home, and bring up children, to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience, and generally to enjoy those privileges long recognized as common law as essential to an orderly pursuit of happiness by free men.
That's quite a list of protected rights.
And with a couple of exceptions, none of them are actually written into the text of the Constitution.
While limiting the role of government in regulating education, the justices expanded what freedoms should be expected in American life. Freedom to pursue an education, to get a job, to raise a family. There had previously been definitions of property rights, but personal liberties?
those were never discussed prior to State v. Meyer. And that's incredible. I'm sure it was always something discussed or maybe something almost assumed.
It wasn't something that the law needed to be bothered with.
No, because it was just determined by society.
So everyone agrees it's a great victory for religious schools and educational freedom. After that, cracks start to show in how liberals and conservatives interpret Meyer. That list of specific freedoms in the opinion, some conservative legal minds argue judges have read way too much into that list.
I think the right is the kind of right that ought to be in the Constitution, but it's not the job of the Supreme Court to amend the Constitution to put it in there. It's the kind of right that ought to be ratified by the people.
As an originalist, Duncan focuses on the original text of the Constitution, the way it was understood by the generation that ratified it in 1788. A progressive civil liberties lawyer like Rose Godinez takes that list of liberties as a healthy way for the courts to clarify how laws adapt to the ideals of a free society.
What is the liberty at stake? Court, please tell us.
The liberties listed in the Meyer opinion have been cited in thousands of court cases over the years.
You can see why an attorney would cite that in every brief, because you want to show how that liberty has been in place since the 1920s. That is the goal. When you're arguing a case, you want to show that the precedent has been there for a very long time. And what a better case than State v. Meyer.
While it took years of evolving law to get there, it all came together when the Meyer opinion became one of the key arguments in court cases that could never have been imagined in that little church school on the prairie. In 1965, a husband and wife successfully challenged a Connecticut law banning birth control. In legalizing contraception, the justices used the liberties listed in the Meyer case to shape a new legal concept, a right to privacy.
Well, if parents have the right to direct the education of their children, surely they must have the right to decide whether to have children. And so there's a right to contraception. And then it gets to Roe.
That's Roe, as in Roe v. Wade, 1973. The U.S. Supreme Court legalizes abortion.
And the court says, well, we've got these rights, upbringing of children, these rights to decide whether or not to have children. These rights are broad enough to include the right to abortion.
Maybe the right to contraception is not necessarily encompassed within that right that State v. Meyer did, but it opened up the liberty discussion.
Oh, yay, oh, yay, oh, yay. All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court.
As we know, a more conservative Supreme Court overturned the Roe decision protecting abortion in 2022.
We will hear argument this morning in Case 19-1392, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization.
During oral arguments, the attorney representing abortion providers name-checks the Nebraska precedent.
That's how the court has interpreted the Liberty Clause for over 100 years in cases going back to Meyer, Griswold, Carey, Loving, Lawrence.
I understand what you're saying, but what I'm trying to focus on, in the old days we used to say it was a right to privacy that the court found in the due process, substantive due process clause.
That's Justice Clarence Thomas, questioning whether the Meyer opinion and those that followed should have been used to shape a constitutionally protected right to privacy.
And I'm trying to get you to tell me, what are we relying on now? Is it privacy? Is it autonomy? What is it?
The court's majority opinion called that interpretation of the Nebraska case a flawed account of history. There's more. Remember, the opinion in Meyer v. Nebraska specifically says Americans have a right to marry and establish a home. In 2015, when the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states, Justice Anthony Kennedy delivered the opinion from the bench and hearkened back to the court's century-old ruling in Meyer.
Like other choices protected by the Due Process Clause, decisions concerning marriage are among the most intimate that an individual can make.
That didn't sit well with constitutional originalists like Duncan, since same-sex couples were not accommodated in the Constitution as originally written. He believes the justices misused the Nebraska case.
This is not a careful examination of the text of the Constitution. This is kind of a new principle being read into the Constitution.
As you'd expect, Godinez sees it differently.
Liberty is something you can't have both ways. You can't just advocate for liberty in one particular area and just religious freedom. Because that's not how it is in the Constitution. It just says liberty.
At Zion Lutheran Church, Pastor David Fettern takes pride in the example set by Robert Meyer. The fact the teacher did not flinch and persisted.
If we know that we stay true to what our faith is, and then that's backed up by somebody like the United States Supreme Court, that has a lot of relevance.
Here's the paradox. Pastor Fettern points out that Robert Meyer would likely hate how his Supreme Court precedent was used by others to defend same-sex marriage and rights to seek contraception and abortion.
And even people, well, even my parents were really, to a large degree, aghast, is probably a good word to use, shocked when Roe v. Wade came down in 1973. That was
citing Meyer v. Nebraska.
Exactly. Nobody would have conceived or thought of that. Certainly not the participants in the actual trial, Raymond Parpart, Mr. Meyer, Mr. Edgerton, or all those jurors. I can't imagine what that day would have been like for them when that Supreme Court case was finalized and they would have made reference to Meyer versus Nebraska. That would have been a really hard day for those people.
Meyer's attorney, Arthur Mullen, said that opinion covered the whole span of human experience. It's likely the debate will be heard once again over whether Meyer v. Nebraska can be used to solidify personal liberties in many other cases, defining the rights of transgender youth, banning books and blocking controversial public school courses.
It fundamentally touches every single person, which is incredible because Mr. Meyer is just one person.
Literally just some guy who's
a teacher, yeah. Amazing.
It takes a brave man or woman to stand against the government and to say, I'm going to assert my constitutional rights. I think a lot of these people are heroes.
I'll give the last word to the lawyer, Arthur Mullen, Robert Meyer's successful defender before the U.S. Supreme Court.
Outside of the state of Nebraska, Robert T. Meyer is usually no more than a name in a law book. To me, he is and will always be one of the valiant defenders of American liberties.
You have been listening to Once Again, our exploration of history that's shaping the news today. It's a copyrighted production of Nebraska Public Media. And if you like what you heard, leave us a review where you found us. Once Again is produced and researched and hosted by Bill Kelly. That's me. Co-producer Emily Kreutz is the lead audio engineer, with studio assistance from Jeff Smith. Editorial review is handled by news director Jay Omar and Chris Husted of the Midwest Newsroom. Special thanks to the Nebraska State Historical Society for its help as the state of Nebraska's keeper of archival records. And thanks to the Hamilton County Clerk of the Court and the Plainsman Museum in Aurora. And thank you to the voices you heard in this episode. Michael Hevican, the retired Chief Justice of the Nebraska Supreme Court, John Green, David Fettern, Benna Althaus, Jude Rush, Sam Broderson, and Elizabeth Rembert. On our webpage, there's a list of books, documents, and other resources we used to research this episode, along with some photos you might find interesting. That's at nebraskapublicmedia.org/onceagain. While you're there, we want to hear from you. What you like, what you didn't, and your ideas for future topics on Once Again.
Once Again is funded in part by the John C. and Catherine S. Angle Charitable Trust in support of history programming on Nebraska Public Media.